You know, usually when you look back at how a massive map-altering war begins, you kind of expect to find an equally massive trigger.
Oh, absolutely. You want a clear, deafening, inciting incident.
Exactly, like an assassination of an archduke or a catastrophic bombing of a harbor.
Or a blatant, undeniable army crossing a recognized border.
Right, an event so loud that it drowns out everything else, and everyone at the time just points and says, there, that's the moment the world broke.
We definitely crave that kind of historical clarity. I mean, clean, unambiguous starting lines make a conflict feel inevitable.
Yeah, it satisfies that need for direct cause and effect. We want the explosion that explains the fire.
Exactly. But then you step into the origins of the U.S.-Mexican War in the 1840s, and suddenly you just find yourself squinting.
Squinting is the perfect word for it, because you're looking for that deafening explosion, and instead what you find is a magazine article.
Right, a magazine article. And then a few months later, this incredibly murky, highly confusing argument over a sparsely populated riverbank in southern Texas.
It feels completely out of proportion to the scale of the violence that follows.
It's the absolute definition of a historical optical illusion.
Mm.
I mean, depending on which map you look at, or which political ideology you subscribe to, or even just which side of a specific river you're standing on, you're perceiving a completely different reality.
Which is wild to think about.
Yeah, there is no universally agreed upon inciting incident, because the very nature of the provocation was literally manufactured out of ambiguity.
Which brings us to our mission for you, the listener, in today's deep dive. We are zeroing in on a really critical, incredibly volatile window of time, 1845 to 1846.
A very narrow window, but so much happens.
So much. And we're going to unpack exactly how a catchy magazine slogan combined with a highly questionable border skirmish ended up plunging the United States into a massive war of conquest.
A war that would ultimately strip Mexico of half its national territory.
Right, and expand the United States all the way to the Pacific Ocean.
It is fundamentally a story of how a nation can essentially talk itself into a conflict. We're looking at a war where the core justice of the violence was intensely contested by the people actually living through it.
And it remains intensely debated by historians today.
Exactly. This was not a unified nation marching forward, is a deeply fractured republic just tearing itself apart over whether to pull the trigger.
And because of that intense division, I want to establish our approach right at the top. We're keeping this conversational, but intellectually rigorous.
That's the goal.
As we walk through this timeline, we are going to be staring directly at some very intense political rhetoric and, frankly, some deeply unsettling racial ideologies from the 1840s.
Very unsettling.
Yeah. So for you listening, please know that you and I are acting purely as guides to the original source material and the historical interpretations we have here. We aren't taking any ideological sides, modern or historical.
Right. Our goal is strictly to convey the ideas, the prejudices, and the political mechanics that actually drove the historical actors who lived this reality.
Because that context is non-negotiable.
It really is.
Mm-hmm.
To understand how the map of North America was violently redrawn, we have to examine the 1840s through the lens of the people wielding the power. Even when their underlying viewpoints are, well, abhorrent to our modern sensibilities.
Exactly. If we sanitize the motivations, we just lose the actual mechanics of the history.
Spot on.
Oh, and a quick vocabulary note before we dive in. For any high school students listening or just anyone who likes clear definitions, we are going to be pausing to break down key historical vocabulary words as they pop up throughout this deep dive.
Always a good idea to define our terms.
So let's step into those mechanics.
Yeah.
The year is 1845. It's a year that a specific two-word phrase entered the American lexicon.
A very famous phrase.
Yeah, a phrase that would function less like a description and more like a smell, just altering the trajectory of the continent.
We're talking about the summer of 1845, specifically July. And to understand the phrase, we have to look at the architect behind it.
Right, John L. O'Sullivan. And O'Sullivan is an interesting figure because he isn't a general or a senator.
No, not at all. He's a journalist.
He's the Democratic editor of a publication called the United States Magazine and Democratic Review.
Quite a mouthful.
Yeah. And in July, he publishes an essay simply titled Annexation. He's writing specifically about the debate over admitting Texas into the Union.
Right.
And buried in this essay, he drops the phrase manifest destiny.
Those two words have arguably haunted and shaped American foreign policy ever since.
Absolutely.
But we should be really precise about what O'Sullivan was actually arguing when he put those specific words together. The language of the 1840s was highly intentional.
Okay, let's pause for our first high school vocab breakdown. Let's unpack the phrase manifest destiny. What are we literally talking about here?
Well, if you look at the literal roots, manifest means something that is clear, obvious, undeniable to the eye. You don't have to debate it. It's plainly visible.
Right. And destiny.
Destiny implies a predetermined future, an endpoint that is bound to happen regardless of human intervention.
So when O'Sullivan says manifest destiny, he is asserting that the United States has a clear, visually obvious, entirely predetermined future to, and this is his exact phrasing, overspread the continent.
And he doesn't stop at just the geography. He attaches a theological engine to it.
How so?
He argues that foreign powers, specifically looking at Great Britain and France, who are meddling in Texas and California at the time, have no right to interfere with, quote, the fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions.
Wow. Okay, that sentence is a masterpiece of political framing. Let's unpack this a bit.
It really is.
I mean, people in America had been pushing west for generations,
Yeah.
right? Land hunger was the oldest story on the continent. But O'Sullivan acts as an intellectual packager here.
Like a PR guy.
Exactly, like a modern marketing analogy. He takes that raw, base material desire for real estate and he rebrands it as something holy by using a word like providence, which implies divine foresight and the active intervention of God. He makes the aggressive act of taking land look like the passive, innocent act of receiving a divine gift.
The rhetorical inversion there is brilliant. I mean, think about it. If a politician stands up and says, we want to conquer our neighbors to take their valuable resources, they sound like a dangerous aggressor.
Obviously.
But if that same politician says, we are merely stepping into the fulfillment of a destiny allotted by Providence, they suddenly sound like a humble instrument of a higher power.
That word fulfillment does so much heavy lifting.
It really does. It frames continental expansion not as an invasion, but as the natural realization of a divine plan. It just removes the moral culpability from the conqueror.
And he pairs that divine mandate with demographic math. He explicitly points to the yearly multiplying millions.
Yeah, the population boom.
He's looking at the massive birth rates and immigration rates of the United States in the 1840s and essentially saying, look, we are growing so incredibly fast, it's just biology, it's nature.
Right, like where else are all these people supposed to go?
Exactly. The land must be ours because the population demands it. He makes expansion sound like a law of physics.
It's an argument rooted in Malthusian anxiety. You know, the fear of a population outgrowing its resources. By pointing to the crowded, polluted cities of Europe, O'Sullivan and his contemporaries argued that American democracy required open space to survive.
But we can't really analyze this rhetoric of divine gifts and biological necessity without examining the deeply exclusionary current running right beneath it.
No, we absolutely can't.
And this brings us to a major historical interpretation in our dossier, the work of historian Reginald Horsman.
Yes. Horsman's 1981 book, Race and Manifest Destiny, offers a foundational thesis for understanding this era.
What's his main argument?
He argues that O'Sullivan's concept wasn't just a convenient excuse for a land grab. It was an entirely organizing worldview, deeply and inextricably fused with a very specific racial ideology known as Anglo-Saxonism.
Okay, let's do another high school vocab breakdown here. We have providential, which we established means involving divine foresight or intervention.
Right.
But what is Anglo-Saxonism in the context of the 19th century?
To understand Horsman's argument, we have to look closely at what Anglo-Saxonism meant back then. It was a pseudo-scientific and cultural conviction that white, English-descended peoples were inherently superior to all other races.
Just a blatant white supremacist ideology.
Entirely. The proponents of this ideology believed that the Anglo-Saxon race was uniquely gifted by God and nature with the capacity for liberty, self-government, and advanced civilization.
So if we follow Horsman's logic, manifest destiny isn't some universal invitation to share the continent.
Not at all.
The drive for land carried an arrogant, baked-in conviction. The belief was that the Native American nations, as well as the Catholic mixed-race population of Mexico, were fundamentally incapable of this high level of civilization.
And therefore, they were destined by nature to recede.
That is the grim core of the logic right there. The land itself was viewed as a providential inheritance for the United States, but the non-white people currently living on that land were viewed as a problem. an obstacle to progress.
According to Horsman, by the 1840s, American expansionism had just hardened into a racial imperative. The Anglo-Saxon superiority complex demanded continental dominance,
Right.
and the phrase manifest destiny provided the moral permission structure to displace, govern, or exclude anyone who didn't fit that racial profile.
But, whenever a historian presents a unified theory like that racial ideology and divine providence were the primary engines driving a nation toward war, you have to stress test it.
Of course, history is rarely just one clean philosophical current.
Exactly. If we buy into the idea that this was purely a racial crusade, we might be ignoring a massive piece of the 1840s puzzle. Here's where it gets really interesting. What happens if we step away from O'Sullivan's soaring magazine rhetoric and look at the actual bank ledgers?
Following the honey.
Yeah. Was Manifest Destiny the true engine, or was it a highly effective marketing campaign for a much more calculated material motive? Let's follow the money.
Well, following the money in the 1840s leads you swiftly away from the Texas border and straight toward the Pacific Ocean.
Interesting.
This introduces the first rival engine of expansion, international commerce.
Because while the political rhetoric was heavily focused on the southern border with Texas, there was this massive, overwhelming commercial obsession with California.
Huge obsession.
And it wasn't about farming or gold. I mean, the gold rush hasn't even happened yet. The obsession was entirely about deep water harbors, specifically the ports of San Francisco and San Diego.
Those harbors were viewed by American strategists and northern merchants as the grand geopolitical prizes of the continent.
Why were they so important?
They weren't just picturesque coastlines. In an era where maritime trade was the lifeblood of national wealth, those ports were seen as the absolute vital gateways to the incredibly lucrative markets of Asia, specifically the China trade.
So controlling San Francisco meant controlling the Pacific commercial frontier.
Exactly. And it seems like this wasn't just driven by an abstract desire for more wealth. It was driven by a very acute, intense paranoia in Washington.
Paranoia about who?
American policymakers were constantly looking over their shoulders at Europe. Specifically, they were haunted by the British Empire.
Okay, we have to remember the context of the 1840s. The United States had fought 2 wars with Britain in recent memory.
Right, the Revolution and the War of 1812.
And Britain was the undisputed global naval superpower at the time.
They were. So American policymakers looked at a map of a very weakly defended Mexican California, and they just assumed that if the United States didn't seize those ports immediately, the British Navy would swoop in and take them. They were terrified of being boxed out of the Pacific entirely.
Okay, wait, let me push back on the timeline here, though.
Sure.
If you have American politicians in Washington studying nautical charts, salivating over Pacific trade routes, and terrified that the British are going to buy or seize the same real estate, doesn't that fundamentally undermine the whole divine mission narrative?
It certainly changes the tone.
I mean, it makes Manifest Destiny look less like a holy commandment to spread democracy and much more like a hard-nosed, preemptive real estate grab. It's essentially saying, God gave us this continent, but we really need to hustle to beat London to the Port Authority.
It absolutely complicates the narrative. From the perspective of economic historians, O'Sullivan's theology of expansion was essentially the marketing department providing cover for the logistics department.
The marketing department for the logistics department. I love that.
Right. The ideological rhetoric of Providence and Anglo-Saxonism was incredibly useful for rallying the voting public. But the actual strategic imperative discussed in the backrooms of Washington was the China trade.
You need the deep water ports to secure your national economy, so you tell the public it is their divine destiny to march to the ocean.
Exactly. The economic motive suggests a highly rational, calculated drive for power, rather than some mystical religious awakening.
Okay, so we have the theological packaging, and we have the international commercial engine, but we can't fully understand the momentum of 1845 without looking at the most volatile domestic engine of all.
The internal politics.
Right. The expansion of the United States wasn't just a debate about foreign policy. It was fundamentally a debate about the balance of internal power. And that brings us to the poisonous politics of slavery.
You really cannot disentangle the origins of the U.S.-Mexican War from the institution of slavery. They are inextricably linked.
The catalyst for this entire crisis was the annexation of Texas, which formally entered the Union as a slave state in December of 1845.
And adding Texas as a slave state wasn't an accidental byproduct of expansion. For a highly influential bloc of Southern politicians, adding new slave territory was the primary objective.
And the central architect of the strategy was Senator John C. Calhoun of South Carolina.
Calhoun is a pivotal, highly complex figure here. He had served as Secretary of State under President John Tyler just before our timeline begins.
Right.
And during that tenure, he engineered the treaty for the annexation of Texas quite explicitly as a pro-slavery project.
Let's break down the mechanics of what Calhoun was actually trying to achieve. Why was adding new dirt so vital to the survival of slavery?
It came down to raw political mathematics in Washington. Under the Constitution, the power in the Senate was balanced based on states, not population.
Right, 2 senators per state.
Exactly. As the northern states industrialized and grew their populations rapidly through immigration, the South realized they were going to be permanently outvoted in the House of Representatives.
Because the House is based on population.
Correct. So their only mechanism to protect the institution of slavery from federal interference was to maintain a balance of power in the Senate.
So they needed a constant influx of new slave states to match the admission of new free states in the North.
Precisely. For Calhoun and his Southern allies, bringing in Texas and potentially carving it up into multiple slave states, or taking even more territory from Mexico, was a deliberate existential strategy.
It was survival for them.
It was the only way to expand the geographical domain of slavery and secure their long-term political power in the capital.
And the politicians in the North could read a map just as well as Calhoun. The abolitionists and the anti-slavery Whigs looked at this aggressive push southward and westward, and they didn't see divine providence or a quest for Pacific ports.
They saw exactly what Calhoun was doing.
They termed it the slave power conspiracy. They deeply believed that the federal government and the military were being hijacked by Southern elites to create a vast new empire for human bondage.
But here's where we encounter one of the most fascinating and deeply disturbing paradoxes of this entire era.
Oh, this part is wild.
It really is.
Yep.
If we go back to Reginald Horsman's thesis, the idea that virulent racial ideology, Anglo-Saxonism, fueled the expansion, we see a profound contradiction when we look closely at John C. Calhoun.
Because Calhoun was a staunch white supremacist.
Yes, very vocal about it. But his specific brand of racism actually made him deeply oppose the idea of taking too much territory from Mexico.
I want to make sure I understand the logic here. He views expansion as the key to saving slavery, but he draws a line on how far south they should expand. Why?
Because of the people who live there. Calhoun wanted the land, but he wanted it empty. He actively and loudly warned the U.S. Senate against the danger of swallowing Mexico's population. He was fiercely opposed to integrating Mexico's citizens who were Catholic and primarily of mixed indigenous and European descent into the American political system.
So his racism was so profound, his belief in white supremacy so absolute, that it functioned as a barrier against total conquest.
Exactly. He argued that American democratic institutions were designed exclusively for the white race.
That's just wow.
He famously argued on the Senate floor that the United States had never dreamt of incorporating into the Union any but the Caucasian race. For Calhoun, incorporating millions of non-white Mexican citizens would destroy the racial purity that he believed was essential to the Republic.
That is an incredible tension. If we synthesize these forces, racial thinking in the 1840s is operating at completely cross purposes.
It's pulling in two directions.
On one hand, you have O'Sullivan's Manifest Destiny, where Anglo-Saxon arrogance acts as the rocket fuel propelling the country westward, convincing them they have a right to displace anyone in their path.
Right.
But on the other hand, for a powerful architect of expansion like Calhoun, that exact same racism acts as a bizarre restraint, a set of brakes. He's saying, we are superior, therefore we cannot possibly absorb or govern these non-white populations without corrupting ourselves.
It creates a bizarre equilibrium. It fueled the absolute hunger for the dirt, the ports, the agricultural land for slavery, but the racial prejudice acted as a massive political wall against taking the fully populated central territories of Mexico.
Race, international commerce, and the domestic politics of slavery. These are not three separate stories happening in the 1840s.
No, they're deeply entangled strands of the exact same rope, all pulling the nation toward a breaking point.
But, abstract forces, ideology, economics, political systems, they don't declare wars by themselves. History requires human agency.
Someone has to make a choice.
Right. Someone has to sit at a desk, look at all these volatile strands, and make the active choice to pull them. Someone has to give the order for an army to march.
And to understand how this tension turned into bloodshed, we have to look at the man sitting in the Oval Office.
We have to examine the presidency of James K. Polk.
Enter James K. Polk.
Polk is a fascinating character. He is the 11th president of the United States, a Democrat elected in 1844, and he came into office on a fiercely, unapologetically expansionist platform.
He was considered a dark horse candidate, actually, not expected to win the nomination at all.
But he rode the wave of popular desire for territorial growth. And what makes his presidency so structurally unique is that he campaigned on a promise to serve only one term.
Which fundamentally altered his timeline.
Because he's on a ticking clock.
Exactly. By locking himself into a single 4-year term, Polk put himself in a massive rush. He didn't have the luxury of letting diplomatic pressure slowly build over a decade.
He had a highly specific checklist of acquisitions, right?
Oh, very specific. He wanted to secure the annexation of Texas, he wanted to resolve the Oregon boundary dispute with Great Britain, and above all else, he was obsessed with acquiring California.
And Polk's intense personal drive brings us to a major counterargument in our historical dossier. We spent time unpacking Reginald Horsman's thesis, which frames manifest destiny as this vast, almost atmospheric tide of racial ideology sweeping the nation.
Right, the providential tide.
Now we need to contrast that with the argument presented by historian Amy S. Greenberg in her 2012 book, A Wicked War.
Greenberg's thesis heavily leans on a crucial concept for historical analysis.
Okay, time for another high school vocab breakdown. What is this concept?
Contingency. The idea of contingency argues that historical outcomes are never inevitable. They're entirely dependent on specific choices made by specific individuals under specific circumstances.
So it means that if a different person had been elected president in 1844, or if a specific diplomatic letter had been worded differently, the U.S.-Mexican War might never have happened.
Precisely.
So applying that lens to the 1840s, Greenberg is arguing that the war wasn't a nation sleepwalking toward an inevitable destiny dictated by providence or economics.
No, she argues it was a highly calculated, deeply contestable choice made by one specific man.
Polk.
Yes, Polk had a personal, driving ambition to expand the borders, and he actively maneuvered the pieces on the geopolitical board to force a confrontation.
So what does this all mean? If Horsman is saying manifest destiny was a rising tide that naturally breached the banks, Greenberg is saying, no, it was just one guy, James K. Polk, grabbing a sledgehammer and busting open the dam on purpose.
I like that analogy. Greenberg emphasizes presidential agency. Polk didn't just passively ride the cultural wave of expansionism, he weaponized it.
He used it as a tool.
He made deliberate military and diplomatic choices that backed Mexico into a corner and forced the country into a crisis.
I really like how our sources present this historian debate because it essentially forms a triangle of causality.
How do you mean?
Well, in one corner, you have Horsman arguing for ideology. The racial providential mission was the engine. In the second corner, you have the economic historians pointing to the ledgers. Pure commercial hunger for the Pacific ports drove the ship. And in the third corner, you have Greenberg pointing to the Oval Office. The calculated political agency of James K. Polk was the decisive factor.
And the most sophisticated historical analysis doesn't force you to pick one and discard the other two. The real task is to see how they interact.
Right.
The reality is likely that Polk utilized the commercial paranoia about the British and the ideological fervor of manifest destiny as the raw materials to execute his highly specific personal design for the map.
And to see exactly how Polk executed that design, how he translated the desire for California into a shooting war, we have to look at the ground level.
We have to get into the geography.
We have to see how a failed diplomatic mission in Mexico City was carefully managed into a manufactured military crisis on a riverbank in Texas. Let's move our timeline to the late fall of 1845.
The military crisis was born directly from the ashes of a diplomatic failure. In late 1845, President Polk dispatches a special envoy, a man named John Slidell, to Mexico City.
And Slidell is sent with a very aggressive, highly transactional set of instructions.
Very transactional. He is basically walking in with a briefcase full of money.
Polk authorizes Slidell to offer up to $25 million to purchase California, another $5 million for New Mexico, and to officially settle the lingering boundary dispute over where Texas ends and Mexico begins.
Polk really thinks he can simply buy the continent.
But the timing of Slidell's arrival and just the sheer arrogance of the offer completely ignored the political reality on the ground in Mexico.
You have to remember the sequence of events here. On December 29, 1845, the United States formally admitted Texas as a state.
Which was a massive provocation. Texas had declared its independence from Mexico back in 1836, nearly a decade earlier, but Mexico had never formally recognized that independence.
No, they still considered Texas to be a rebellious province.
The Mexican government had explicitly and repeatedly warned Washington that annexing Texas would be viewed as an act of war.
So the United States ignores the warning, annexes the territory, and then immediately sends John Slidell to the Mexican capital to say, hey, we know you're furious about Texas, but while we're here, can we also buy the entire western half of your country?
It's politically impossible for Mexico to accept that. I mean, the Mexican government at the time, under President Jose Joaquin de Herrera, is already incredibly fragile.
Very fragile. The Mexican public is outraged over the loss of Texas.
If Herrera even sat down at a table with Slidell to discuss selling California, his government would be instantly overthrown for treason.
And in fact, rumors that Herrera might receive Slidell did help trigger a coup. It brought a much more hardline general, Mariano Paredes, to power.
So the political climate in Mexico City made diplomacy impossible.
The government flatly refused to officially receive John Slidell or view his credentials. They just slammed the diplomatic door shut. The mission was a total failure.
And when diplomacy fails, Polk doesn't give up on California. He just changes his tool set. He turns from diplomacy to geography.
And this is where we have to map out the exact physical location of the flashpoint, because the ambiguity of the border is what allows the war to happen.
Right. When the U.S. annexed Texas, they didn't just inherit a new state. They inherited Texas's most aggressive, maximalist territorial claim against Mexico.
Let's draw this out for the listener. If you look at a map of southern Texas, you have two major rivers running roughly parallel toward the Gulf of Mexico.
Right.
The Republic of Texas, and therefore President Polk, claimed that the southern and western border of Texas was the Rio Grande.
But the Mexican government insisted, based on centuries of Spanish and Mexican administrative history, that the historical border of the Texas province was a completely different river.
The Nueces River, which sits about 150 miles to the north and east of the Rio Grande.
This creates a massive geographic gray zone. And here's another quick high school vocab term for us: the disputed territory.
That 150-mile wedge of land sitting right between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande.
And what was that land like?
It was a harsh, chaparral-covered environment, very sparsely settled. Both nations vehemently claimed sovereignty over it, but neither nation actively, fully controlled it with a military presence.
It was a theoretical borderland waiting for a match.
And in the spring of 1846, James K. Polk drops the match.
He orders General Zachary Taylor, a veteran commander known to his men as Old Rough and Ready, to take his U.S. Army troops, who were currently stationed securely on the Nueces River, and march them.
Polk orders Taylor to march his army completely across that 150-mile disputed gap and parks them directly on the northern bank of the Rio Grande.
And General Taylor doesn't just arrive and set up a few tents. His men dig in for a siege. They construct extensive fortified earthworks, which they eventually name Fort Texas.
And crucially, they build this fort directly across the river from the prominent, highly populated Mexican town of Matamoros.
Right.
The U.S. Army positions its artillery batteries, so they are pointing directly at the town square of Matamoros.
Okay, I have to step in here and apply some basic logic, because the official justification from Washington is fascinating. Polk and his allies frame this as a neutral act of border defense.
That was the official line.
But if you take a heavily armed military force, march them into a territory that you know is actively and hotly contested by a sovereign neighbor, build a fortress, and physically aim cannons at the homes of their citizens, aren't you practically begging the other side to shoot first?
It certainly looks that way.
How could anyone in Washington look at that deployment and call it defensive?
You are hitting on the exact dual reality of the border. The justification depends entirely on which map you choose to believe. To the Polk administration, the Rio Grande was the absolute, unquestionable border of the United States. By their logic, General Taylor had not invaded Mexico. He had simply marched across Texas to garrison American soil and protect the frontier against a hostile neighbor that had just rejected an American diplomat.
So it was, legally in their eyes, a defensive posture on domestic land.
Exactly. But if you cross the river to Matamoros and look at it from Mexico City's perspective,
It's completely different.
to Mexico City, the Nueces was the border. Therefore, a heavily armed foreign military force had just crossed an international boundary, marched 150 miles deep into Mexican sovereign territory, constructed a fort, and blockaded the Rio Grande, aiming weapons at Mexican civilians.
To them, Zachary Taylor was the vanguard of an invading army.
Both governments were observing the exact same soldiers standing on the exact same patch of dirt, but the political and legal realities they constructed around that dirt were worlds apart.
And an ambiguity like that cannot hold. You have two armies, heavily armed, highly agitated, staring at each other across a relatively narrow river. You can't just leave a loaded weapon on the table and expect no one to pick it up.
The tension was suffocating.
And finally, in late April of 1846, that ambiguity was violently shattered by a cavalry skirmish in the brush.
Which brings us to the actual spark that ignited the U.S.-Mexican War, the Thornton Affair.
So we are at April 25, 1846. General Taylor, sitting in Fort Texas, sends out a patrol of U.S. dragoons,
Which are mounted cavalrymen. The patrol is led by a captain named Seth Thornton.
and they're sent roughly 20 miles up the Rio Grande to investigate reports that a large force of Mexican troops might have crossed the river into the disputed territory.
The reports were accurate. A significant Mexican cavalry force, commanded by General Anastasio Torrejon, had crossed the river.
And near a farm area called Rancho de Carcitos, Captain Thornton's patrol rides directly into an ambush.
They are completely surrounded in an enclosed field. The American patrol is vastly outnumbered and overwhelmed.
It's a disaster. The exact casualty numbers vary slightly depending on the historical sources, but generally it's accepted that between 11 and 16 American soldiers are killed in the ensuing firefight.
And the rest of the patrol, including Captain Thornton, are forced to surrender and are taken captive.
Blood has finally been spilled. The abstract debate over maps and treaties has become a physical reality of dead soldiers. The spark has caught.
But here is the detail from our dossier that genuinely alters how you view this entire timeline. It's about what was happening back in Washington, D.C. at the exact moment this skirmish occurred.
Yes, this is the revelation provided by James K. Polk's own highly detailed personal diary.
This is incredible because news in 1846 travels at the speed of a horse. It takes roughly 2 weeks for a dispatch to get from the Rio Grande to Washington.
Right.
But according to Polk's diary, on May 9th, before he'd received any word whatsoever about Captain Thornton or the ambush, Polk convened his cabinet. He was already proposing to ask Congress for a formal declaration of war against Mexico.
Wait, really? He was prepared to launch a war without a single shot having been fired on the border?
Yes.
But on what grounds? If Taylor's army hasn't been attacked yet, how is Polk planning to justify a war of conquest to the American people?
He was going to base it entirely on diplomatic grievances.
Diplomatic grievances.
He argued that Mexico's refusal to receive John Slidell was a grave national insult. Furthermore, he was going to cite a series of lingering, unpaid financial claims that the Mexican government owed to American citizens from damages incurred during various Mexican revolutions over the previous decades.
He was essentially ready to go to war over an insulted envoy and bad financial debts.
Yes, that was the plan.
But asking Congress to declare a massive war over unpaid debts and diplomatic etiquette is an incredibly tough sell. It doesn't rally the public. It sounds petty, not patriotic.
Polk's cabinet was actually hesitant about this plan. It wasn't landing well, even with his own inner circle.
But then, that very evening, the messenger arrives from the South.
The dispatches from General Taylor are delivered.
The Thornton Affair has happened. American soldiers are dead.
And suddenly, the political landscape shifts completely. Polk no longer has to convince Congress to care about John Slidell's bruised ego. He has a much, much cleaner, far more visceral story to tell.
He seizes the opportunity immediately. He spends Sunday drafting a new message, and on Monday, May 11, 1846, President Polk delivers his revised war message to Congress.
And in this message, he utters a sentence that is arguably one of the most masterful and controversial pieces of rhetorical manipulation in American presidential history.
What's the sentence?
He claims that after repeated provocations, Mexico, quote, has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory, and shed American blood upon the American soil.
Shed American blood upon the American soil. It is a dark, heavy sentence, but purely from the standpoint of political communication, you have to marvel at its brilliance.
It's astonishingly effective. Look at what Polk accomplishes in those few words. He takes a highly contested, profoundly murky frontier, a 150-mile gray zone that Mexico actively claimed, and that the U.S. had only occupied for a few weeks. And he instantly, verbally converts it into unambiguous, unquestionable American soil.
He totally erases the context of the Nueces River.
Completely erases it.
He takes a military skirmish that he arguably provoked by ordering an army to aim cannons at a foreign town, and he reframes it entirely as an unprovoked invasion. He turns a calculated push for expansion into a desperate defensive war of national survival.
He collapses all the complex legal nuance, all the diplomatic history, all the debate over the maps into a single highly emotional image: American bloodstaining American dirt.
It is designed to demand an immediate, visceral, patriotic response from the legislature.
You cannot debate treaty law or cartography when your young men are allegedly being slaughtered in their own backyards.
And Congress responds exactly how Polk needs them to. The legislative machine kicks into high gear. Just 2 days later, on May 13, Congress votes to declare war.
And if you look at the raw numbers, it looks like a landslide of national unity.
But what were the votes?
In the House of Representatives, the vote is 174 to 14. In the Senate, it passes 40 to 2.
But those overwhelming majorities are highly deceptive. They conceal a massive amount of political agony and fierce backroom maneuvering, particularly for the opposition party, the Whigs.
Right, because if you just read those numbers, 174 to 14, you'd assume everyone in Washington was cheering for Manifest Destiny.
But the Whigs were actually incredibly vocal in their objections leading up to the vote. They weren't fooled by Polk's rhetoric. They saw exactly how the geography had been manipulated.
Many Whig politicians fully believed that Polk had deliberately provoked the war. They understood that placing Zachary Taylor's army on the banks of the Rio Grande was a calculated move meant to invite a clash, specifically so Polk could play the victim and grab California.
But when it came time to actually cast their votes, the Whigs found themselves completely trapped by a brilliant parliamentary maneuver engineered by the Democrats.
Let's break down how that trap actually functioned. Why didn't the Whigs just vote no?
Because of how the legislation was structured. The formal declaration of war wasn't a standalone resolution. It was directly attached to the emergency appropriations bill required to fund the military and send supplies to General Taylor.
Oh, that is ruthless.
The troops are already in the field. News has just arrived that they have been fired upon and are potentially surrounded. If a Whig politician votes no on the bill because they object to the war, they are simultaneously voting to defund and abandon American soldiers who are currently under attack.
And to the voters back home, that looks like treason.
Exactly. It is political suicide to vote against supplying troops under fire. But the trap had a second layer.
The preamble.
The Democrats attached a highly specific preamble to this funding bill. The preamble explicitly stated that the war existed, quote, by the act of the Republic of Mexico.
So to get the money to save Taylor's men, the Whigs were forced to vote yes on the entire package, which meant legally swallowing Polk's version of history.
They had to officially go on the record agreeing that Mexico started the war with an unprovoked invasion, even though they privately, or even publicly, believed Polk had engineered the entire crisis.
That is the essence of political hardball. They were gagged by patriotism. The Democrats even limited the debate in the House to just 2 hours, preventing any meaningful investigation into where the skirmish actually happened.
So the bill passes, the trap snaps shut. The armies are funded, and the invasion of Mexico begins in earnest.
But even with those crushing majorities in Congress, this war was never truly uncontested.
No, the dissenting voices that arose in the aftermath of that vote, people who refused to accept the narrative of American blood on American soil, produced some of the most famous foundational moral arguments in American history.
Let's look at the people who pushed back against Manifest Destiny.
Examining the dissenters is crucial because it shatters the illusion that the entire nation viewed expansion as a divine mandate. The opposition proves that the moral and legal rot at the center of Polk's justification was obvious to many at the time.
Let's start with the political opposition in Washington, which took some time to mobilize. We are going to jump forward to December of 1847.
The war has been raging for over a year and a half. American forces have pushed deep into Mexico.
And a freshman Whig congressman from Illinois, serving his very first term, stands up in the House and introduces a series of resolutions. His name is Abraham Lincoln.
Lincoln was relatively unknown on the national stage at this point, but his approach to dismantling Polk's war narrative was devastatingly analytical. He didn't rely on grand moralizing. He acted like the trial lawyer he was.
He introduced what became known as the spot resolutions. Let's examine the specific logic Lincoln deployed here. What exactly was he demanding from the president?
Lincoln filed a series of incredibly precise, targeted questions demanding that President Polk provide Congress with evidence identifying the exact, specific spot of soil where Captain Thornton's men were killed.
You wanted a pin on a map.
Yes. And furthermore, Lincoln demanded that Polk prove, with historical and legal evidence, that this specific spot was unequivocally American soil before General Taylor marched his army there.
It's a brilliant cross-examination. Lincoln is ignoring the broad, fuzzy ideology of manifest destiny. He is surgically attacking the core factual premise of Polk's entire May 11th war message.
Because if the spot where the blood was shed was located in the disputed zone, if it historically belonged to Mexico, or if it was at least jointly claimed and unresolved, then Polk's entire justification that Mexico invaded our territory completely collapses.
Precisely. Lincoln is forcing the administration to admit the geographic sleight of hand. He asked if the citizens of that specific spot had ever submitted to the laws of Texas or the United States, pointing out that they were historically Mexican citizens.
Now, legislatively, the spot resolutions went absolutely nowhere. The Democratic majority simply ignored them and refused to bring them to a vote.
And politically, back home in Illinois, taking such a strong, pedantic stance against a war where local volunteers were fighting and dying cost Lincoln dearly. He was mocked as Spotty Lincoln.
But historically, it remains the sharpest, most logical dismantling of the war's founding myth.
So that's how dissent functioned inside the Capitol building. But outside of Washington, the moral outrage took entirely different, highly personal forms.
Let's travel out of the political arena and up to Concord, Massachusetts in July of 1846. A writer and philosopher named Henry David Thoreau is walking into town to get a shoe repaired, and he is intercepted by the local constable, Sam Staples.
Staples asks Thoreau to pay his past-due poll tax.
Thoreau refuses, and the constable throws him in the local jail for the night.
Thoreau's single night in that Concord jail cell becomes a cornerstone of American philosophical history. He didn't just forget to pay his tax. It was a deliberate, calculated act of protest.
But why the poll tax? What was the specific connection he was drawing between a local Massachusetts tax and a war happening thousands of miles away in Texas?
Thoreau explicitly tied the collection of the poll tax, which supported the state government, to the broader actions of the federal government. He viewed the U.S.-Mexican War not as a noble defense of the homeland, but as a deeply corrupt, aggressive engine designed specifically for the expansion of slavery.
Tying back to the abolitionist fears of John C. Calhoun's agenda.
Exactly. To pay the tax was, in Thoreau's mind, to offer his financial and moral consent to the state. He refused to become complicit in a war of conquest meant to spread human bondage.
He believed that voting against the war wasn't enough if your money was still funding it.
And he took that experience that night in a jail cell before someone else anonymously paid the tax for him, and he wrote a lecture about it. That lecture evolved and was eventually published in 1849 as the essay Civil Disobedience.
He argued that if the law requires you to be an agent of injustice to another, you must break the law. You must let your life be a counterfriction to stop the machine.
It is a direct philosophical response to the machinery of Polk's war. It established the foundation of principled, nonviolent resistance in America, influencing movements for generations to come.
But perhaps the most surprising and arguably the most damning voice of dissent didn't come from a Whig politician or a transcendentalist philosopher. It came directly from inside the military tent, from an officer who executed the invasion.
This brings us to a young lieutenant serving in the Quartermaster Corps under General Zachary Taylor on the front lines in Texas and Mexico. His name is Ulysses S. Grant.
Grant fought in the major battles of this war. He served under Taylor and later under General Winfield Scott. He saw the logistics, the violence, and the reality of conquest on the ground level.
And years later, in his 1885 memoirs written while he was dying of cancer, long after he had served as the commanding general of the victorious Union Army and served 2 terms as President of the United States, he delivered a stunning, unequivocal verdict on the U.S.-Mexican War.
He wrote that he regarded the conflict as, quote, one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation.
He explicitly compared the United States to European monarchies, saying the Republic was following the bad example of empires seeking territorial aggrandizement.
And he went even further inward. He confessed that as a young man, he lacked the moral courage to resign his commission. He knew the war was fundamentally wrong while he was actively fighting it, but he felt trapped by his military duty and his education at West Point.
That is a staggering admission from a man of Grant's historical stature. You have the primary architect of the Union victory in the Civil War, looking back and publicly condemning his own service in a previous war as an act of profound injustice.
He didn't view Mexico as an enemy. He viewed them as victims of a manufactured provocation.
And there is an incredible historical irony here that we have to pause and appreciate.
Yeah.
Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant.
The two men who would, a decade and a half later, act as the commander-in-chief and the top commanding general to save the United States during its greatest existential crisis, the Civil War.
Both of these men cut their political and moral teeth by deeply opposing or profoundly regretting this specific presidential war of choice in the 1840s.
They looked at the rhetoric of manifest destiny and they didn't see divine providence. They saw a profound moral injustice wrapped in a flag.
They recognized the danger of an expansionist executive manufacturing a crisis. They saw exactly how the intoxicating rhetoric of destiny, combined with raw racial prejudice, could be manipulated to bypass the constitutional checks on waging war.
They understood that the map was redrawn not by God, but by force and deception.
We have covered a massive amount of historical ground today.
We started in the ideological clouds with John L. O'Sullivan in 1845, seeing how he packaged raw land hunger into the holy providential mission of manifest destiny.
A concept deeply anchored in the exclusionary arrogance of Anglo-Saxon racial superiority.
We then grounded that ideology in material reality, examining the cold, calculated commercial hunger for California's deepwater ports, driven by a geopolitical paranoia over the British Empire controlling the Pacific trade.
We dissected the poisonous domestic politics of slavery, seeing how figures like John C. Calhoun explicitly manipulated the annexation of Texas as a mechanism to expand slave power and maintain political control in Washington.
We weighed the historical debate over causality, contrasting Reginald Horsman's vision of an unstoppable tide of racial destiny against Amy Greenberg's focus on the deliberate, calculated political agency of President James K. Polk.
We tracked the specific mechanics of provocation, analyzing how Polk managed a diplomatic failure into a military crisis by marching General Taylor's army across 150 miles of disputed territory, aiming cannons at a Mexican town to force a reaction.
We saw how the Thornton ambush provided the necessary spark, allowing Polk to brilliantly and darkly reframe the conflict with the claim that American blood had been shed on American soil, springing a parliamentary trap on the Whig opposition.
And finally, we listened to the voices of dissent. Lincoln's surgical demand to see the spot, Thoreau's night in jail birthing the philosophy of civil disobedience, and Grant's somber retrospective admission that the war he fought was fundamentally unjust.
And as we conclude this exploration, it's vital to remember that the questions we've raised remain unresolved among historians today.
Was Horsman right? Was racial ideology the true, inescapable engine of continental expansion? Or were the economic historians right that the ledger books and the Pacific ports drove the ship?
Was the war deliberately provoked by an imperial presidency, or was Washington simply defending a valid territorial claim against a hostile neighbor?
The evidence pulls the narrative in multiple conflicting directions.
The history is messy, contradictory, and rarely gives us a clean, inciting incident. Which leads me to a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over on your own as we sign off.
We spent time unpacking the paradox of John C. Calhoun.
Right. Calhoun was fiercely pro-slavery and deeply racist, yet he used those exact racial prejudices as his primary argument against integrating the mixed-race Catholic population of Mexico into the United States.
His bigotry made him argue against total conquest. He wanted the dirt, but his racism made him refuse the people. It is a striking contradiction in the logic of white supremacy during that era.
So, if racial prejudice was so prevalent and powerful during the 1840s that figures like Calhoun used it as a reason to limit the taking of Mexican territory, how does that complicate our modern assumption that racism only ever acts as an accelerator for imperial expansion?
That's a great question.
Could the darkest, most virulent prejudices of the 1840s have actually been the very thing that kept the United States from attempting to conquer and absorb the entirety of the Mexican Republic? It is a deeply unsettling question about how bigotry operates as both an engine and a brake in geopolitics.
It forces us to realize that history rarely moves in straight, predictable lines. Sometimes the very ideologies that push a nation forward contain the internal contradictions that eventually halt it.
History is an optical illusion. We look for the massive explosion that starts a war, the clear moral dividing line. But sometimes when you stare long enough at the origins of a conflict, you realize the explosion wasn't the cause.
The real cause was a carefully worded magazine article, a deliberate march across a murky riverbank, and a nation that managed to talk itself into believing that its appetite was actually its destiny.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the contested origins of the U.S.-Mexican War.